Before tonight's story begins, you are warmly invited to share where you are listening from in the comments below. It is always a comfort to see this quiet community reaching across the world, night by night. And if these stories bring you a sense of calm, you are welcome to subscribe and join us on these peaceful journeys. Now, take a moment to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or your favorite chair. Gently close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath and allow the day to soften and fade. Let my voice carry you quietly into sleep, to a place where imagination drifts and rest comes naturally. Picture, if you will, a low stone house at the end of a lane, still wet from the night's rain, somewhere inland in Yorkshire, in the last week of October, in the year 1894. The sky outside is the color of a dove's wing, not yet decided whether it means to clear. Smoke rises, thin and straight from a single chimney, because only one fire has been laid this morning where once there were two, and inside, in the grey hush before the household has properly woken, a woman named Martha Ellison is standing quite still in a doorway, listening to a silence she has not yet learned the shape of. The house has not yet fully returned to its ordinary self. If you were to walk its narrow hall this morning, you would find, pressed flat into the runner near the door, a scatter of petals gone the soft brown of old tea, refused by every pass of the broom, as though they meant to stay exactly where the wedding had let them fall. You would see, in the front parlor, two borrowed chairs standing against the wall, their cane seats still faintly dented from 3 days' worth of departed guests, waiting to be carried back to the church hall and not yet carried. And beneath the parlor table, if you crouched low enough to look, you would find a single length of white ribbon, coiled loosely where it had slipped from someone's hand in the last hurried hour of packing, and you would understand, somehow, without being told, that Martha has seen it there each time she has passed, and has left it lying every single time, as though moving it might undo the fact that the wedding had truly happened at all. She wakes this particular morning at the hour she has woken for the better part of 30 years, that grey, unnamed hour before the light outside has properly decided what sort of day it means to be, before the first bird has settled fully into its song, when a house still holds, deep in its walls, the last banked warmth of the night's fire. She rises without needing to think about it. She dresses in the dim, feeling her way more than seeing it, and downstairs, kneeling before the cold grate, she lays the kindling in the same careful lattice her own mother taught her 40 years ago, her hands moving through a pattern so old and so familiar that her mind is free, the whole time, to be almost anywhere else at all. She fills the kettle. She sets it upon the hob and listens to it begin its low, private muttering, the sound so ordinary and so unremarkable that it takes her a full minute to notice her own hand has already reached, entirely of its own accord, for the dresser, has already lifted down not one cup, but two, the everyday china chipped faintly at the rim, one for herself, and one from a habit worn so deep it no longer required her permission, for whoever might be first down the stairs behind her. She stands there a moment, with the second cup held in her open palm. It weighs nothing at all, of course. It is only china, Only the ordinary morning cup she has washed and set back upon its hook, perhaps 10,000 mornings, without a single thought given to the gesture. And yet, held now in the grey half-light, with the kettle beginning its climb toward the boil, it seems to Martha to carry a weight entirely out of proportion to its size. The whole weight, perhaps, of every morning that has come before this one, every morning in which there was, without question, someone else in the house to drink from it. She turns it once, slowly, in her fingers. Then, careful as though it might shatter against the flagstones if she were careless with it even now, she sets it back upon its hook beside its fellow and makes her tea alone, in the one cup only. She does not sit at the kitchen table with it, as she generally would. Instead, she carries the cup through toward the front of the house, and it is there, passing the half-open door of the room that has belonged, for the entire span of her daughter's life, to her daughter alone, that her feet simply stop. Look at it with me a moment. This room, exactly as Martha sees it now in the growing morning light. The pegs along the near wall, which held, for so many years, a familiar disorder of dresses and a good winter coat, stand entirely bare. 4 small iron hooks, and nothing upon a single one of them. The carpet beneath the window, when the light falls just so across its worn pile, still shows 4 faint indentations where the bed legs pressed for 11 years. A small pale rectangle worked permanently into the weave, as though the furniture itself left behind its own quiet shadow on its way out through the door. And there, forgotten upon the window-sill in the last frantic scramble of the wedding morning, sits a plain wooden box of needles and thread, its lid not quite closed, a spool of blue cotton still threaded halfway through a needle that never finished its stitch, and never will now, not in this room. Martha stands in that doorway a long while. The tea in her cup grows cool. Somewhere outside, a cartwheel creaks along the wet lane, and a dog barks twice and falls silent, and the ordinary world goes on entirely unaware of the particular, private reckoning taking place in this one small doorway. She does not doubt, standing there, that her children love her. Let me be clear with you on that point, because it matters, and because Martha herself is entirely clear on it. Her eldest son writes faithfully every fortnight from the mill town where he has settled with his wife and their 2 boys, his letters full of small, warm, unremarkable news. Her second daughter sends a Christmas parcel every single year without fail, wrapped always in the same brown paper, tied always with the same careful double knot, as though the ritual of the wrapping mattered nearly as much as whatever lay inside it. And her youngest, her Alice, 3 days a bride now, gone to make a new life somewhere along the coast with a young man Martha has grown, across a single year's acquaintance, to like well enough, had wept and clung to her mother's arm at the church door, as though the wedding itself were a kind of leaving, rather than the beginning it was always meant to be. None of them have set her aside. It is nothing so sharp, so unkind, as that. It is only, Martha understands now, standing very still, in a doorway that holds no one at all, a plain and entirely ordinary arithmetic, the sort of sum every mother arrives at, sooner or later, and is nevertheless never quite prepared to see written out so starkly before her. Her children have grown, each of them, into households entirely their own, with their own small urgent hours, their own kettles to fill of a morning, their own doors to lock at night against the cold. No one in the whole wide world requires her to be anywhere in particular come tomorrow. No one waits upon her the way a small hand once waited, tugging at her skirt in a crowded market square, or the way her husband's cough in the deep of the night had once brought her instantly, entirely, helplessly awake. She turns the thought over slowly, the way you might turn an unfamiliar old coin between your fingers, uncertain yet what it is truly worth. What does she like, she wonders? Not what is required of her, not what must be seen to before someone else wakes to find it left undone, but what she herself, freely and for no other reason than her own wanting, might choose to spend an ordinary afternoon upon. She searches for an answer, standing there in the pale growing light, and finds, to her own quiet discomfort, that she does not entirely know. It is not a comfortable thing to discover about oneself at 59 years old, and she stands with that discomfort a good while longer before she can bring herself to carry her empty cup back through to the kitchen. It is there, on the very table where her husband once read the local paper aloud to her of an evening before his final illness took even that small pleasure from them both, that her eye falls upon the notice. It sits modestly among columns of shipping intelligence, a notice of an upcoming church bazaar, an advertisement for a patent liniment guaranteed to ease the rheumatism, one small plain paragraph, no more, announcing a room to let, by the week or the fortnight, in a fishing village called Greyhaven, on the Yorkshire coast. Plain and clean, the notice says. Terms reasonable. Inquire of a Mrs. R. Carden. Martha reads it once. She reads it again, more slowly. She could not, examining it a third time, have told you with any real certainty what precisely it was that caught her eye among so many other small announcements that morning, except, perhaps, that she has never in the whole of her life had the smallest occasion to think about a place called Greyhaven, and that this entire absence of any prior claim upon it seems, this particular grey morning, to recommend it above every other possibility set out on the page. She writes to Mrs. Carden that same afternoon, before she can carry the notion to her sister, or to the vicar's wife, or to any of the well-meaning voices that might, out of the kindest intentions in the world, talk her gently and thoroughly out of it. She proposes a fortnight's stay, beginning the following week. She signs the letter simply, Mrs. M. Ellison, and offers no further account of who she is or why she means to travel alone. It is, she understands, sealing the envelope and setting it upon the hall table to catch the morning post, the very first decision she has made in longer than she can easily reckon, that has not first passed through the narrow, familiar gate of whether it suits anyone else's convenience at all. That evening, before she climbs the stairs to bed, she goes once more into her daughter's room. She gathers the last few overlooked things, the box of needles from the windowsill, a stray hairpin caught beneath the washstand, a second ribbon that matches the one still lying beneath the parlor table, and sets them together, gently, upon the bare mattress. Then she closes the door. She turns the key in its lock, feeling the small mechanism give, with a soft, final click, and she slips the key into the pocket of her apron, where it rides all evening, with a weight quite out of all proportion to its size. Afterward, alone in her own room, she takes down the small traveling case from the top of the wardrobe and blows a fine skin of dust from its lid. And there, in the last hour of that long, strange day, with the house entirely quiet around her and the fire burned low downstairs, she begins, without hurrying, to pack it. Not for a daughter this time, not for a husband, not for any occasion in the world but her own. A plain dark dress, a warmer shawl against whatever wind the coast might offer, her good boots, and, almost as an afterthought, the little box of needles rescued from the windowsill, because her hands, she has already begun to suspect, will not care much for the idea of a fortnight with nothing at all to occupy them. Imagine the window of a railway carriage, streaked faintly at one corner with the last of the morning's rain, and beyond it, unrolling slowly like a length of grey-green cloth, a country that grows steadily damper and quieter as the morning wears itself toward noon. Wet fields first, hedgerows, still dripping though no rain presently falls, the ditches running full and brown. Then villages of weathered stone, roofs slick and dark, crouched low against a wind you cannot feel from inside the carriage, but can see plainly enough in the way the bare trees lean. And then, mile by slow, unhurried mile, the land itself begins to lower, the hills growing gentler, the horizon drawing nearer, until it seems almost as though the whole country were leaning quietly forward, listening for something, toward a sea Martha cannot yet see, but has already begun, somewhere past midday, to taste faintly on the air, whenever the window is cracked an inch against the closeness of the carriage. She sits alone, her small case set upon the rack above her, her gloved hands folded in her lap, and she notices, really notices, the way one notices a missing tooth with the tongue, how curious it feels to be responsible, just now, for nothing more than this, a case, a folded ticket, the hour of her own next meal. For the better part of her life, her attention has travelled outward before it ever properly settled inward. A husband's collar needing turning, a child's cough needing watching through the small hours, a pot needing minding on the hob while some more urgent matter called her elsewhere in the house. Sitting now, with no one beside her, requiring so much as a glance, she feels the unfamiliar lightness of it almost as a kind of dizziness, the particular swaying looseness a shoulder feels once a heavy basket, carried so long it had come to seem simply another part of the arm, is finally, unexpectedly, set down upon the ground. An elderly clergyman shares her compartment as far as York, his collar a little frayed, his umbrella dripping gently onto the floor between them. He asks, kindly enough, whether she travels down to visit family upon the coast. Martha finds herself hesitating over so simple and ordinary a question a good deal longer than seems reasonable, turning it over as though it were a trick question rather than mere politeness, before answering only that she is going down to Greyhaven for a fortnight, which is entirely true, and which she leaves the good clergyman to draw whatever further conclusions he pleases from. He does not press her further, and she is grateful, though she could not, examining her own gratitude, quite say why so plain a question had felt, in that unsettled moment, so oddly difficult to answer. From the small station, little more, in truth, than a single platform, a shuttered ticket window, and a bench with one broken slat, she takes a hired trap down into Greyhaven as the light begins its long autumn slide toward evening. The road winds steeply between banks grown thick with gorse gone rust-colored now for the season. The trap wheels, finding every rut with a small jolting complaint, and then, all at once, rounding a final shoulder of hillside, the whole village reveals itself before her entirely. Come and see it with her, just for a moment. Slate roofs step down toward the water in uneven, tumbling ranks, grey and silver blue where the last light catches them. Low chimneys breathe thin, straight smoke up into an evening gone suddenly, wonderfully still. The cobbled lanes fall away, at angles surely too steep for any cart, but the small stubborn ones built especially for them. And beyond it all lies the harbour itself, the colour of beaten pewter under the fading sky, ringed about with boats drawn up safe for the night, and the long dark silhouettes of nets hung out along their wooden stakes to dry, swaying very slightly in a wind too gentle now to be called anything more than a breath. Martha leans forward in the trap, watching it come toward her, and feels something in her chest loosen very slightly. A small, unexpected easing low beneath the ribs that she could not entirely have accounted for if you had asked her to. Ruth Carden meets her at the door of a narrow stone house set 2 streets back from the water, its front step scrubbed nearly white, a pot of thrift gone leggy with the season standing sentinel beside it like a small tired soldier. Ruth is a woman perhaps 2 years Martha's junior, broad through the shoulder and forearm, in the particular way of someone who has done real physical work across the whole span of her life, her grey hair drawn back plainly from a face weathered by salt wind rather than by worry, her eyes steady and pale as a winter sky. She takes Martha's measure in a single, unhurried glance, and there is no unkindness in it, and Martha notices with a private, grateful relief, very little curiosity either. She does not ask why a woman of 59 travels alone. She does not ask whether there is a husband waiting somewhere behind her, or a family that might sensibly have accompanied her, or what particular circumstance has sent her all this way to a fishing village she has never before had the smallest cause to think of. She explains instead, briskly and completely, precisely what a lodger under her roof may expect. Breakfast at 7 sharp, the kettle always on the hob by 6, hot water fetched of a morning from the copper in the scullery, and the window latch in the upstairs room turned twice, mind, not once, against a sea wind rising in the night, or it will rattle the sash till dawn, and no one in the house will sleep a wink for it. The room above is plain, and Martha finds, climbing the narrow stair behind her landlady, her hand trailing along a banister worn smooth by countless other hands before her own, that its very plainness pleases her more than any grander accommodation could possibly have done. An iron bedstead, a washstand bearing a plain white basin and jug, a single chair with a faded floral cushion, gone soft with years of quiet use, and a window, come stand at it with her a moment, that looks down over the crowded, huddled roofs to the harbour beyond, where the last boats of the day are just now being made fast for the night, small figures moving unhurried along the darkening quay. She stands at that window a long while before she so much as opens her case. It comes to her slowly, standing there with the last light draining from the water below, deep purple now, where it had been pewter only minutes before, that this is the first room in a very great many years that holds, within its four plain walls, no earlier version of herself at all. There is no small cot that once stood folded in a corner, long since given away or broken up for kindling. There is no pencil mark upon a door frame recording some child's careful height at 7, and again at 10, and again, taller and more solemn, at 13. There is no particular chair kept always in its accustomed place because someone else, gone now from the house, had always preferred it just there. This room holds nothing whatsoever of her yet. It is entirely, simply, itself, waiting, she thinks, to become whatever she might make of it across the coming fortnight, and nothing more than that, and nothing less. She unpacks slowly in the fading light, laying her few things into the single drawer of the washstand, and goes down at Ruth's call to a supper of fish and bread taken together at the kitchen table, just the two of them, the conversation running along easy, unremarkable channels, whether the weather will hold or break by morning, the price fish has lately fetched at market, the particular and long-standing stubbornness of the kitchen range's flue, which apparently has never once, in living memory, drawn quite properly on a north wind. Martha finds she is grateful for the very ordinariness of it all. No one at this table requires anything more of her than passing the bread when it is wanted, and she passes it gladly, and eats, and finds the fish very good indeed. That night she lies a long while awake in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sea working steadily and patiently at the harbour wall below her window, a low, ceaseless breathing sound, entirely unlike anything her own inland house has ever offered her of a night, where the loudest thing to be heard after dark was only ever the tick of the parlour clock, and some nights her own husband's quiet snore beside her. She thinks of her own bed, standing empty now, in the house she left behind her that morning. She thinks of her daughter's room, its key riding still in the pocket of the dress, folded now over the back of this unfamiliar chair, and she understands, lying there in the dark with the unfamiliar rhythm of the tide for company, that no one anywhere in the whole wide world is waiting for her to wake at any particular hour come morning, and that the thought, which might once, not so very long ago, have frightened her considerably, brings her instead, on this first night in a room that holds nothing of her yet, something closer to a long, slow, thoroughly unfamiliar kind of rest. Morning comes to Greyhaven with a particular pale cleanness Martha has not yet learned to expect, and on her first proper day there she wakes to it slowly, lying a moment beneath the thin blanket simply listening, a cart creaking somewhere below on the cobbles, a single gull crying out sharp and lonesome over the rooftops, and beneath it all, steady as breath, the sea itself, murmuring on exactly as it had the whole night through, as though it had never once paused for her sleep at all. She dresses in the cool morning air, goes down to a breakfast Ruth has already laid upon the scrubbed table, and afterward, with the whole of an unclaimed day stretching out before her for what feels like the first time in longer than she can properly remember, she walks the length of the village simply to see it, her boots finding their way over damp cobbles still dark from the night. The harbour at this hour is a busy, unhurried sort of place, and quite unlike any bustle Martha has known in her life before this. Boats come in low and heavy in the water, their hulls dark and glistening, and baskets of fish, silver, still faintly twitching, catching what light there is in small quick flashes, are swung up onto the quay by men whose hands move with the same unthinking, practiced competence her own had once brought to bread dough, rising beneath a cloth, or to a hem turned by touch alone in a darkened room. Along the wooden stakes above the tide line, long dark nets hang drying, stiff now with salt, and the whole air along the front carries a smell she cannot at first properly name, tar and brine, and something older beneath both, something mineral and patient, the smell, she will come to understand before very long, of work that has been done in exactly this place for longer than anyone now living can rightly account for. It is behind Ruth's own house. Turning down a narrow passage she had not noticed in yesterday's fading light, that she comes upon a long, low building with its wide door thrown entirely open to the water, a net loft, though she does not yet know to call it that by name. She might easily have walked past it altogether, had not something in its open, unguarded doorway seemed almost to reach out and draw her in, the way an open kitchen door at home might once have drawn in a passing neighbor, unbidden and entirely welcome all the same. Come and stand with her a moment in that doorway, and let your eyes adjust. Inside, the light falls in long grey bars through high, dust-softened windows, catching motes that turn slowly, unhurried, in the still air. Coils of tarred line hang looped from the roof beams overhead. Wooden floats are stacked in careless, leaning pyramids against one wall. Netting needles of every size lie arranged in shallow wooden trays along a long bench, worn pale and smooth at their centers by years of passing hands. Low three-legged stools stand gathered in a loose half-circle near the middle of the floor, and in the far corner, close by a small black iron stove, a blackened kettle sits with the settled, permanent look of an object that has never once, in the whole of its working life, been permitted to go entirely cold. Ruth is there already, bent low with 3 other women Martha has not yet met, over a great herring net spread across the whole width of the floor between them. Torn in several places after a long, hard season's use, its holes and its weaknesses examined with the same grave, unhurried attention a physician might bring to a patient not gravely ill, but certainly in real need of proper care. None of the women look up at once when Martha appears in the doorway, the pale morning light behind her. It is Ruth who notices her first, and only nods once, a brief, plain gesture that seems to say she is welcome to come in, or equally welcome to go on her way, and that either choice will occasion, from anyone present, no particular remark whatsoever. Martha sits near the door, not wishing to intrude upon work she understands nothing of, and it is there, watching the women's hands move with such quiet, unhurried certainty over the great net, that she notices her own hands growing restless in her lap, the way hands do, she has come to learn across a lifetime of them, when they are asked to sit idle in a room full of purposeful work. She has, tucked into her pocket from the packing 3 days before, a glove of her own, with a seam split along one finger, and it is this she takes out now, without any particular plan behind it, and begins to mend. simply because her fingers seem to want some occupation of their own, whatever occupies the room around her. She works in silence a good quarter hour before she notices, glancing up briefly to ease a cramp in her neck, that Ruth has looked over more than once, her attention caught, it seems, by the neat, unhurried, entirely competent stitches closing the small tear in the old glove's seam. Martha says nothing of it. Neither, at first, does Ruth, but near the end of that long, unhurried afternoon, when the light in the high windows has begun to lean toward gold, and the shadows of the roof beams have crept slowly across the floor, Ruth crosses the room, wiping salt-roughened hands upon her apron, and stands a moment before Martha's low stool. "You've a steady hand," she says, without any preamble at all. In the plain, unornamented way Martha is already coming to recognize as entirely her own. "Come back tomorrow, if the fancy takes you, and I'll show you a knot or two." Martha's first instinct is to demur. She explains, a little apologetically, gesturing vaguely at the great net still spread across the floor, that she has never in her life done work with any bearing whatsoever upon the sea, that her hands know hems and darning and the turning of a worn collar, but nothing at all of nets or twine or the particular stubborn knots that hold a fishing family's whole livelihood together against the fierce pull of a loaded catch. Ruth only shakes her head at this, in the manner of a woman who has heard the very same small protest offered 100 times before and has long since stopped finding it in the least persuasive. "There's not a woman in this loft," she says, glancing round at the others as though inviting them to contradict her, which none of them do, who wasn't once entirely ignorant of the whole business. "Agnes there could no more tie a proper knot at your age than fly clean over that roof. It comes to the hands soon enough, if you'll only give it half a chance to." She says nothing further on the matter just then, but before she leaves the loft that evening, banking the small stove carefully for the night and drawing the wide door partly to against the coming chill off the water, she presses into Martha's open palm a small wooden netting needle, plain, quite unpainted, its whole surface worn to a soft, pale smoothness by years upon years of other hands closing over it before Martha's own ever had occasion to. It sits in her palm with a particular, settled weight, as though it had been waiting there in its tray for exactly this purpose and no other, and Martha carries it back to her room above Ruth's kitchen that evening, the last of the daylight fading fast now over the rooftops, and sets it carefully upon the washstand, where she finds herself glancing at it more than once before she blows out her candle, wondering, not entirely without a small, unfamiliar flutter of nerves low in her chest, what on earth the following afternoon might bring her. Ruth is as good as her word. The following afternoon, once the dinner things are cleared away and the loft has settled back into its familiar, unhurried industry, the low murmur of talk, the small scrape of stools, the kettle beginning its patient climb toward the boil in the corner, she sets Martha upon a stool near the window, spreads a worn, practiced length of netting across her knees, and begins, with the patient and entirely unsentimental manner of a woman who has taught this same lesson to a great many hands before Martha's own, to show her how the work is properly done. She shows her first how to sit, the body angled just so toward the light, the net held taut but never strained across one knee, the shoulders loose rather than hunched forward in the way that leads, Ruth says, to an aching back by the end of a long afternoon. She shows her how to hold the twine so it draws evenly through the fingers without ever cutting into the soft skin of the palm, and how to judge, by the width of a small flat wooden gauge no longer than a hairpin, that each new mesh comes out precisely the same size as the one beside it, so that the whole finished length will hang true and even when at last it takes the real weight of a catch, rather than sagging crooked to one side. And she shows her, slowest and most carefully of all, the particular sheet bend that holds a net together entire, a knot that must be drawn tight enough to bear genuine strain, and yet shaped correctly enough that it will not slip loose the very first time the net is hauled dripping over a gunwale into a rocking boat. Martha's first attempts are, by her own private and rather unforgiving estimation, thoroughly disheartening. Picture her there, at the window, the low afternoon light falling across her lap, her brow furrowed in a concentration she has not felt required of her in years. Her earliest knots come out drawn far too tight, the twine biting hard into itself until the small mesh puckers and will not lie flat, no matter how she coaxes it. Several after that are tied too loosely and must be picked apart again with the sharp point of the needle and begun entirely afresh, the twine already beginning to fray a little at its cut ends from so much handling. She feels, for the better part of that first long hour, a particular and quite unfamiliar clumsiness. The same two hands that have turned a hem in the dark by touch alone, that have darned the heel of a stocking without once glancing down to check the stitch, now fumbling over a knot no more complicated, surely, than 100 other small tasks she mastered decades ago without a second thought. "It isn't the hands that are foolish," Ruth says once, not lifting her own eyes from her work, when Martha mutters something rueful under her breath at her fourth spoiled knot in a row. "It's only that they've not yet been asked to learn this particular thing. Give them time, Martha. They'll come round soon enough." The other women in the loft neither mock her efforts nor praise them beyond what they honestly deserve, and Martha finds, somewhat to her own quiet surprise, that she is deeply grateful for the plainness of it. No one exclaims over her small successes, as though she were a child needing to be coaxed past every small difficulty. No one sighs over her failures, as though they confirm some private doubt about whether she truly belongs among them at all. They simply glance over, now and again, between their own stitches, show her once more, without any particular ceremony, how the knot ought properly to have gone, and return to their own work, leaving her to try again, in her own time, at her own unhurried pace, with no audience watching to make the trying any harder than it needs to be. It is in these slow, quiet gaps between one knot and the next, the light shifting almost imperceptibly across the floor, the kettle rising to the boil and being taken off again, the low companionable murmur of talk rising and falling like the tide itself, that Martha begins, slowly, to put names and small histories to the women who most often sit nearest the loft door. There is Agnes Pike, quick-handed and quicker-tongued, perhaps 10 years Martha's junior, who went into service as a girl in some great house many miles inland, and stayed there the better part of 20 years before choosing, quite deliberately, to come home again to Greyhaven the very moment she had saved enough to keep a small room of her own near the water she had missed, she says once, every single day of that long absence. There is Beatrice Rowe, a widow somewhat older than Ruth, who keeps her own small cottage still, at the top of the hill above the harbour, though her son has asked her more than once, and kindly, to come and live under his own roof instead. She speaks of him often, and with evident warmth, and yet something in the set of her shoulders, whenever his name arises, suggests a decision already quietly made and quietly held to, whatever further persuading he may attempt. And there is Lydia Fenn, past 50 herself, who comes to the loft most afternoons not only to mend, but to sit afterward, once the light begins to fail for close work, with a slate and a primer, sounding out her letters with the slow, careful concentration of a woman determined, late as it is, to master a skill that somehow passed her by entirely in girlhood, so that one day, she says once, without much further elaboration, she might read her sister's letters through for herself, in her sister's own words, rather than borrowing another's voice each time a letter comes. None of these small histories arrive whole, or in any order Martha might have predicted. They come instead in fragments, offered sideways between the finding of a torn mesh and the pouring of tea, between one length of coiled spare twine and the next. A single sentence here, a small unguarded remark there, gathering only slowly, across several long afternoons, into something that begins, at last, to resemble real understanding. By the close of that first proper working day, the section of net Martha has mended lies before her still visibly uneven, a knot too tight in one place, a mesh drawn slightly askew in another, the plain and honest evidence of an untrained hand still finding its way through unfamiliar work. Ruth comes by to look it over before the light fails entirely, kneeling a moment to run her fingers along the mended length, and does not, as Martha had half braced herself to expect, take up a needle herself and set it right. She only nods once, in the same brief, unceremonious manner as the day before, and moves the wooden frame along to the next torn place in the larger net, leaving Martha's own small, imperfect section exactly as it stands. Martha looks down at it a long moment before she rises to go. This modest, uneven, entirely her own stretch of mended mesh, no larger really than the span of her two open hands, and feels in it something she could not, in that first moment, quite have found a name for. It is not pride, precisely, nor is it merely the plain relief of a day's work honestly done. It is closer, she thinks, walking back at last through the darkening lanes toward Ruth's house, the smell of salt and tar clinging still, not unpleasantly, to her fingers, to the visible, tangible trace of an afternoon that has belonged, from its very first hour to its very last, entirely and only to herself. The days that follow settle, gradually and without any particular announcement, into a shape entirely their own, a shape Martha finds herself sinking into with something close to relief, the way a body settles at last into a chair properly fitted to it, rather than merely borrowed for an evening. She wakes now not by any bell, nor by the old inland habit of rising before the house itself required her to, but simply by the light, whatever hour it chooses to arrive at, through the thin curtain of her upstairs room, whatever color the sky beyond the harbor has decided to wear that particular morning. Some mornings, this means she rises earlier than she might have wished, roused by a sky already pale and restless at the window. Other mornings, when cloud lies heavy and low over the water, she finds she has slept a good deal later than she has in years, and wakes feeling not guilty, as she might once have, but only rested, in a way that seems, itself, almost unfamiliar to her. She takes her breakfast each morning with Ruth, at the scrubbed kitchen table, the two of them falling easily into an undemanding sort of talk that requires nothing further of either party than the passing of the teapot and an occasional remark on the weather. And afterward, she walks the shore path while the tide still stands low, her boots finding their way now over rock and shifting shingle with a growing, unhurried confidence they had entirely lacked a week before. In the afternoons, she returns to the loft, where the work itself has begun to take on a rhythm she had never expected to find restful, and yet does, entirely. The spreading of a net across the worn floorboards, the slow, careful search along its whole length for a broken mesh, the cutting away of spoiled twine, the patient knotting in of new, the pause for tea, taken standing or seated as the moment allows, and then the coiling of the mended length to one side before the whole quiet process begins again with the very next torn place. She finds, within the space of no more than a week, that her hands have begun learning things her eyes have not yet properly caught up to. She can tell now, without looking, dry, unused hemp from twine that has spent a whole season soaked through with seawater and dried stiff again in a salt wind, one clean and faintly resinous to the nose, the other carrying something saltier and older beneath it, a smell she has come, almost fondly, to think of as the smell of work well used. She finds she can locate a weak place in a length of net before her eyes have properly settled upon it at all, her fingertips catching some small give in the mesh, some faint slackness in the twine that tells her plainly enough where the next hour's careful work must be spent. Feel it with her, if you can, this particular texture of an ordinary Greyhaven afternoon, the low autumn light slanting long and gold through the high dusty windows, catching the drifting motes so they seem almost to hang suspended in the still air, the small companionable scrape of stools being shifted, the low, unhurried murmur of talk rising and falling like something tidal in its own right, the particular rough, salt-stiffened give of old twine beneath her fingertips, and beneath that, faint but constant, the sound of the sea itself working at the harbor wall not 50 yards from where she sits, patient and ceaseless as it has been every single day since long before any of them were born, and will be, she supposes, long after every one of them is gone. Through the loose, unhurried talk that fills the gaps between one knot and the next, she comes to understand a good deal more of the women who sit with her now, each afternoon. She learns that Agnes had not come back to Greyhaven in any sense of failure or defeat, as Martha had privately, and now feels rather unfairly, first assumed, but rather because she had, at long last, put by enough from her years in service to take a small room of her own near the very water she had spent 2 full decades merely remembering and missing in whatever quiet hour a servant's life allowed her for missing things. She learns that Beatrice loves her son entirely and without a shadow of reservation, and simply does not wish to spend her remaining years as a permanent guest beneath his roof. However warmly, however genuinely, that roof is offered to her. She learns that Lydia's slow, determined progress through her primer is undertaken for no grander purpose in all the world than the simple wish, one day, to read her sister's letters through with her own two eyes, in her sister's own words, rather than borrowing someone else's voice each time a letter happens to arrive at her door. Martha begins turning these small histories over in her mind as her needle moves steadily on to understand something she has not, until Greyhaven, ever quite had proper cause to consider, that a woman's later years need not oblige her to narrow the whole remaining span of her life down to the size and shape of her family alone, that a life might go on holding its own particular texture, its own private purpose, even once the children are grown and gone from the house, provided only that a woman can find, as these women plainly have found for themselves, some new ground to stand upon, however small and however unlikely that ground might once have seemed to her. In the loft, she notices no one waits for her to see to the tea. Each woman rises in her own turn, fills the kettle, or feeds the small stove as the moment requires, without the smallest deference paid to age or to seniority. And when Martha's own turn comes round at last, she finds she is permitted, entirely without comment or fuss, simply to remain seated and let another woman's hands do the small necessary work instead. It is, she realizes one particular afternoon, with something very like surprise, the first time in a very great many years that she has been allowed to stay seated while a kettle comes to the boil, without a single part of her feeling that she ought, somehow, to be the one attending to it. It is on just such an afternoon, the low autumn sun slanting long and gold through the high, dusty windows, the net spread quiet across her knees, her needle moving now with a steadiness that requires rather less of her attention than it once demanded, that Martha glances up, quite by chance, at the clock upon Ruth's mantel, visible through the open door to the adjoining kitchen, and realizes, with a small, quiet start deep in her chest, that some 3 hours have passed in which she has not once, not for a single moment, asked herself what her children might presently be needing of her, back home, so many grey miles inland. She sits a while with the realization, her needle stilled entirely in her hand, watching the dust turn slowly, unhurried, gold in the long slanting light, listening to the sea beyond the wide door go on with its own patient, ceaseless work, and only then, slowly, does she take up her needle again and let the thought settle, gently and without any resistance at all, into whatever new shape it seems to want to take. A letter arrives from Alice on the 10th day of Martha's stay, carried up from the harbour front by the same freckled boy who brings the post each morning, his boots ringing on the cobbles below her window well before she is properly dressed. Martha carries the letter up to her own room to read alone, rather than at Ruth's kitchen table, and sits with it on the edge of the iron bed, the window cracked open a careful inch to let in the cool salt air, gulls crying somewhere out over the grey water beyond the rooftops. It is a warm letter, full of the small, ordinary news of a new household just beginning to find its own particular shape. A leak in the scullery roof that Alice's husband had mended himself rather badly, so that it now drips, she writes with evident and rather fond amusement, in a slightly different corner of the room than it used to. A neighbor's cat that has lately taken to visiting each evening for scraps, and shows no sign whatsoever of understanding that it is not, in point of fact, especially wanted there. A receipt for seed cake attempted from Martha's own recipe and only partly successful, the middle having sunk rather alarmingly in the baking, though Alice reports cheerfully enough that her husband ate 2 full slices regardless and pronounced the whole effort excellent, which Martha reads twice over with a private smile she cannot quite suppress. She reads the letter through a second time more slowly, and then sits a good while longer with the loose pages resting in her lap, listening to the small, ordinary sounds of the house below her. Ruth, moving about the kitchen, a door somewhere closing, the kettle's low familiar song beginning again. It is, she notes carefully to herself, turning the pages over once more, an entirely affectionate letter. It carries real warmth in every line. It closes with a hope, plainly and sincerely meant, that her mother is resting well and not missing them all too dreadfully. And yet it contains, nowhere within its 4 close-written pages, the smallest suggestion that Martha ought to come home sooner than she has planned. No hint of any difficulty that only a mother's practiced hand might properly set right. No small crisis calling urgently for her particular attention. She feels, folding the letter carefully back into its worn envelope, 2 quite different things at once, and is rather startled, examining them, to find them sitting so uneasily together in her chest. She feels relief, plain, genuine, uncomplicated relief, that her youngest daughter is managing so entirely, capably well without her, leaking roof and sunken seed cake notwithstanding. And beneath that relief, unbidden, and considerably less welcome, she feels something that can only honestly be called disappointment. A small, hollow ache, low and quiet, at discovering herself so thoroughly, so comfortably unnecessary. She sits with that discomfort a long while, the light shifting slowly across the floorboards of her small room, before she allows herself to look at it squarely, the way one finally looks directly at a bruise one has been carefully avoiding pressing. It comes to her slowly, turning the folded letter over and over between her fingers, that she has spent the better part of her whole adult life operating beneath a belief she has never once, in all these years, properly stopped to examine, that love, to be real and provable, must be demonstrated through necessity, that to be needed is the clearest, and perhaps the only truly reliable, evidence a woman of her years can point to and say, with any real certainty, I matter here. If no one requires her hand at the tiller, some deep old part of her reasons, quiet and insistent, then perhaps her presence itself carries rather less weight in the world than she has always, without quite noticing, assumed it must. She carries this half-examined discomfort with her down to the loft that same afternoon, the sky pressing low and grey over the rooftops, and finds it showing itself in small, telling ways she had not previously noticed in her own behavior. She rises, without thinking, The very moment the kettle on Ruth's small stove begins its first low mutter, crossing the floor before anyone else has thought to ask it of her, she reaches for the coal scuttle the instant the stove wants feeding, though Beatrice sits rather nearer to it that afternoon and has already, in fact, begun to rise for the very same purpose. Twice that week, Ruth catches her at it, and twice, gently, but entirely without any real softness spared for the correction itself, tells her plainly to sit back down and let another woman see properly to her own small share of the day's necessary tasks. "You'll wear yourself thin," Ruth says the second time, not unkindly, her eyes not lifting from her own work, minding everyone's kettle but your own rest. "Sit down, Martha. Beatrice has 2 good hands of her own, same as you." It is that same week that Martha watches Beatrice receive and calmly answer a letter of her own, an invitation from her son, warmly and persuasively worded, urging her once again to give up her small cottage on the hill entirely and come to live, once and for all, beneath his own roof, where he assures her, in a hand Martha catches sight of only briefly over Beatrice's shoulder, that she will want for absolutely nothing. Beatrice does not refuse the offer sharply, nor does she seem in any particular way wounded by the plain necessity of refusing it at all. She reads the letter through once, seated at the loft table, with her tea cooling beside her, folds it calmly along its old creases, and remarks, to no one in particular and to everyone present at once, that she thinks she will go down and stay with him through the very worst of the winter months, as she generally does each year, but that she means, all the same, to keep her own small house exactly as it stands, waiting for her, and to return to it come spring, regardless of how comfortably she is made to feel beneath her son's roof in the meantime. No one in the loft remarks further upon it. It is not offered, Martha understands clearly, as any manner of advice directed toward herself in particular, and yet it settles into her all the same, turning over quietly in her mind, across the following grey, salt-scented days, that nearness to the people one loves most in all the world need not require dependence upon them, any more than a measure of separateness from them need signal any diminishment whatsoever of the love itself. Beatrice's son will have her close at hand through the very hardest, darkest months of the year, and will lose nothing real or lasting in the arrangement for her quiet, gentle insistence on keeping too a door and a hearth entirely her own to return to. Martha begins, in the hush of that same week, lying awake sometimes in the narrow iron bed listening to the sea, to imagine, tentatively at first, and then with a growing and rather surprisingly pleasurable specificity, what the small empty room waiting for her at home, her daughter's room, its key still riding cool in the pocket of her apron, might yet become. Not a shrine, kept dusted and perpetually ready against some future homecoming that will, in all honest likelihood, never truly be required of Alice at all. Something entirely new instead, a room with a purpose belonging, from its very first hour to its last, to Martha herself alone. That evening, by candlelight, she writes her reply to Alice and reads it through carefully, twice, before she seals it, checking, with a small private and rather fierce satisfaction, that she has, nowhere within its pages, promised to come home any sooner than the fortnight she had already, freely and entirely for herself, arranged. Ruth's grandniece, Elsie Carden, has lately taken to coming down to the loft a good deal more often than before, most afternoons now, rather than the occasional Saturday Martha understands had once been her habit alone. She is perhaps 20 years old, quick and capable, dark hair pinned back neatly beneath a plain kerchief, and she has already mastered, Martha soon observes with a small private twinge of envy, the whole of the basic stitchwork that took Martha herself a solid week of fumbling, frustrated afternoons to acquire even passably. Elsie wishes now to learn the further, weightier parts of the trade, how to measure a finished length properly against the standard wooden gauge, how to inspect a whole net critically for weaknesses not yet visibly torn, but only just beginning to give, and how to set a fair price upon completed work before it goes back out to the boats that will depend, quite literally, upon its strength. Ruth is willing enough, on the face of it, to hand her grandniece these smaller tasks. She will set Elsie to inspecting a finished section or to totting up carefully the length of twine a particular job has consumed. But Martha notices, within her first few days of quiet, unhurried observation, a pattern repeating itself with a regularity too consistent, surely, to be entirely accidental. Whatever knot Elsie ties, however plainly sound it is, however evenly drawn, Ruth will take it up afterward, turn it once between her weathered fingers, and retie it herself. Not, so far as Martha can tell, because the girl's work has failed in any real particular, but because the retying itself, that small private act of quiet correction, seems to be a thing Ruth cannot yet quite bring herself to relinquish. Ruth keeps, too, always, and without exception, the low stool nearest the very best of the afternoon light for her own use. Though Elsie's eyes are younger by a full generation and might, by any sensible reckoning, have benefited rather more from it on the close, fiddly work, and every decision of real consequence in the loft. Which job comes in next? What price a particular length of mended net properly commands? Which of the women present ought to be set to which task that day? Remains, entirely and without discussion, in Ruth's own steady hands alone. The other women notice this as clearly as Martha does. She catches Agnes exchange one brief, unreadable glance with Beatrice over the top of the great net, when Ruth retied a knot of Elsie's that had been, by any fair and honest measure, entirely sound. But none of them say a single word of it, then or afterward, and Martha understands, watching the small, silent transaction pass unspoken between the two older women, that this is simply not a matter the loft, as a whole, considers any part of its business to raise aloud. Martha finds, watching Ruth closely in these unguarded moments, the deliberate reach for the knot already tied, the small tightening around her mouth as she works it loose again, that she recognizes a good deal of herself reflected quietly back at her, a woman who has come, over the long, slow course of her own years, to believe, without ever quite examining the belief, that being needed is the surest and perhaps the only truly reliable proof of her own continued worth in the world. It is on a quiet afternoon, the two of them left alone for a time, while the others have gone up to the market, the loft holding an unfamiliar hush around them, that Ruth speaks of it herself at last, without any great preamble, as though the subject has simply been sitting nearby the whole while, patiently waiting for some unguarded moment to be finally, properly raised. "I've been mending nets since I was younger than Elsie is now," she says, her needle moving steadily as she speaks, her eyes not lifting once from the twine in her lap. "My own mother taught me, right here, in this very loft, on this very floor, though the roof's been mended twice over since her day, and the stove's not the one she knew at all. After my Thomas died, she says it plainly, evenly, without any particular weight laid upon the name, though Martha understands at once, from the smallest catch in her breath, precisely what it has cost her to speak her husband's memory aloud so calmly. There wasn't a great deal left in my life that hadn't changed entire, overnight it seemed. The house felt different with him gone out of it. The harbour itself felt different somehow, though I couldn't rightly have told you how, or why a place made of stone and water should feel any different at all for one man's absence. But this loft and this work, this went on being exactly what it had always been. It was the one thing in the whole world I could walk into of a morning and know, straight off, without having to relearn a single part of it. She pauses, drawing a knot tight with rather more force than the twine strictly requires, her knuckles whitening briefly around the twist of it. "I think," she says, more slowly now, her voice dropping, "that I'm afraid, if Elsie can do the whole of it herself, every part of it, start to finish, every bit as well as I ever could manage, there'll be no particular place left in this loft that's truly mine alone anymore. I'll be a woman who sits by the stove of an afternoon and only watches younger hands do the work I was once needed for." Martha does not offer any counsel in reply, though she feels, hearing it spoken so plainly, the small private shock of recognition one feels on hearing one's own, most carefully guarded fear given voice, entire, in another woman's mouth. She asks instead, after letting the quiet settle a moment longer between them, the fire ticking low in the small stove, whether Ruth truly wishes to leave the loft altogether, to be done with it, and free of it, gone from that stool for good and all, or whether what she wants, in fact, is something rather different and rather gentler, simply the freedom to go on sitting there, among the twine and the tarred rope and the old familiar smell of the sea, without carrying, alone and entirely unshared, the whole weight of every single mesh that passes through that wide open door. Ruth does not answer at once. She sits a long while, with her needle stilled in her lap, looking out through the wide door toward the grey water beyond, where a single boat is making slowly for home against the tide, and she says nothing further on the matter that particular afternoon. But the following week, when Elsie brings a finished length of net to her for the usual inspection, Ruth examines it exactly as she always has, running her fingers along its whole careful length, testing a knot here and there with an experienced, practiced tug, and then, for the very first time since Martha came to the loft, she nods once, sets the net aside upon the finished pile without another word, and does not take up her own needle to retie a single stitch of it. A light rain has begun to fall by mid-afternoon, the kind that empties the loft early. Agnes gone home to see to her own supper, Beatrice called away by a neighbour's small errand. Lydia's primer set aside for the day on account of the poor failing light. By 4 o'clock only Martha and Ruth remain, the two of them settled together on their low stools near the small stove, the great herring net lying in loose grey folds across the floor between them, like something quietly sleeping, their tea gone entirely cold and unremarked in the cups beside them. Listen with me to the particular quality of this hour. Rain works steadily at the loft slate roof overhead, a soft continuous whisper broken now and then by a heavier gust flung against the high windows. The small stove ticks and settles as the coals shift within it. Somewhere out in the grey evening, a rope slaps against a mast, over and over, patient as a clock. Neither woman speaks for a long while. It is Martha, in the end, who breaks the quiet, not with any great preamble, but simply because the silence itself, warm and unhurried as it has become between them, seems at last to invite something more than silence in return. I always knew before precisely what was wanted of me, she says, watching the small fire through the stove's grate rather than looking at Ruth directly, as though the words come easier for not being aimed straight at another person's face. That's the plain truth of it, Ruth, as near as I can put it into words. My husband needed his collars turned and his supper on the table by 6, and never once in 30 years had to ask twice for either. The children needed watching and feeding and worrying over when they were slow home from school of an evening, the light failing and no sign of them on the lane. There was never a single morning in 30 years that I woke not knowing exactly what the day required of my two hands. She pauses, working a stray thread loose from the hem of her sleeve, turning it round her finger. When Robert died, and then when the children began, one after another, to make their own households and their own lives, I didn't only miss them, though God knows I did, and do still, some evenings worse than others. I think I missed, near as much, the plain certainty of my own place in things, of knowing, without ever having to ask, exactly where I stood, and what, precisely, I was for. She glances up at Ruth then, and finds, to her own quiet surprise, that she is not ashamed to say the rest of it aloud, here, in this particular quiet, with the rain for company, and no one else present in all the world to overhear her. I kept Alice, my youngest, the one just married. I kept her in small habits, a good while longer than she rightly needed, this last year past. Little things, mostly. Letting her go on bringing me her mending long after she was skilled enough to see to it herself, unaided. Keeping her home of an evening on some small pretext or other, when she might have been out enjoying herself properly, as a young woman ought to be. I told myself it was for her sake, all of it. I think now, saying it plain to you like this, it was rather more for my own. I was afraid, though I'd not have owned to it then, not even to myself, that the whole house would somehow lose its meaning once she'd truly and finally gone from it. Ruth listens to the whole of this without interrupting once, her own needle resting quiet in her lap, and when Martha has finished, she sits a further long moment before answering, as though weighing out her own confession now, with the same careful, deliberate attention she generally gives a difficult length of twine. I've held back the best of the trade from Elsie, she says at last, quietly. Not because she wasn't ready for it. She's been ready this 12-month past, if I'm honest with you. and honesty seems rather easier by this particular fire than it is most other places I could name. I held it back because I couldn't bear the thought of becoming a woman who only sits and watches, who'd taught away every last part of herself worth having, piece by piece, and had nothing left in this loft but a stool by the stove, and no real reason left to be sitting in it at all. She looks down at her own 2 hands, turning them once, palm upward, in the low firelight, the skin rough and creased, and entirely familiar to her. I've had this loft near 40 years, Martha. It's held me up through a good deal. I'm not at all sure I'd have come through otherwise, on my own. I think I was afraid that giving it away, piece by careful piece, meant admitting I no longer needed the holding up myself. And that's not entirely true. As it happens, I still need it. I think now I only need it a little differently than I once did. Martha turns this over slowly, watching the small orange glow shift and settle through the stove's iron grate. I don't believe I want to stop caring for people altogether, she says at last, half to Ruth and half, she suspects, entirely to herself. I don't think that's truly the thing I've been missing these past days, sitting here with you all. I want the choosing of it, is all. When and how, and for whom, rather than having it simply asked of me, morning after morning after morning, whether I've anything left in me to give that particular day or not. Ruth nods slowly at that, as though the sentence has settled something quietly in her own mind as well as Martha's. Passing a trade along, she says, doesn't undo the whole life that earned you the trade in the first place. I think I've had that turned round the wrong way about, a good while now. Elsie doing the work well doesn't erase my 40 years of doing it before her. It only means the loft goes on, past whatever years I've still got left in it. Neither woman makes any great promise to the other that particular evening, nor does either feel, Martha thinks afterward, walking home through the wet dark lanes, that any such promise is truly required between them. They sit a while longer in the settling dusk, the rain easing now to a gentler patter, and then, without further remark, each takes up her needle again and works another slow row of knots into the great net stretched between them, the stove ticking low, the 2 of them entirely at ease now in a silence that no longer, in the smallest way, needs filling. It is only as they are banking the stove at last for the night, gathering shawls and baskets to go, that Ruth crosses to where Elsie's low stool stands, tucked as it generally has been somewhat behind her own, in the second rank of the loft's small half-circle. She takes it up without any comment at all, and sets it down instead beside her own chair, at the very head of the little half-circle, where the best of the light always falls first, and leaves it there, standing so. Martha notices with a quiet warmth the following morning exactly where she had placed it. The great herring net grows smaller upon the loft floor with each passing day, as one torn place after another is found, examined, and finally closed, until what had been, on Martha's very first afternoon among these women, a vast and rather daunting expanse of damaged mesh, has narrowed at last to no more than a final few weak places near one corner, easily finished within a single afternoon's steady, unhurried work. Ruth sets Elsie to the task of inspecting the whole of it, start to end, running her young eyes and her steadier fingers along every single yard of the finished length, and to the further, weightier task of recording, in a small worn ledger kept for exactly this purpose, the total measure of new twine the mending has consumed. It is work of real consequence, the kind that will determine what the loft can fairly charge the boat's owner once the net goes back out to sea, and Ruth hands it over now without a single word of qualification, and does not, this time, so much as glance once over the girl's shoulder as she works through it, quiet and careful, at the long bench. Martha finishes her own final section that same golden afternoon, a modest length near the net's outer edge, the last of the whole season's accumulated damage, and ties off her final knot without a moment's hesitation, drawing it snug and even on her very first attempt. Ruth comes by afterward, as she always has, and runs her fingers along the mended stretch, testing it here and there with an experienced tug. She says nothing at all this time, which Martha has come by now to understand as the loft's own particular, entirely unspoken form of praise, and moves on instead to check carefully through the ledger Elsie has been keeping. It is Beatrice, coiling spare twine into its basket nearby, humming something low and tuneless under her breath, who reminds Martha of the old Greyhaven custom she has not yet had occasion to learn, that whenever a woman finishes her own particular share of a large communal mending, she is permitted, by long habit rather than any written rule at all, to work a short length of coloured thread into the very corner of whatever section she herself has closed. It serves no practical purpose whatsoever, Beatrice explains, settling back on her heels. It adds not the smallest measure of real strength to the net, nor any advantage at all to the boat that will eventually haul it dripping through the water. It serves only, she says, to mark, plainly and permanently, whose particular hands did the work in that particular place, so that a woman passing the drying nets years afterward, an old woman perhaps by then, might look up at some worn, salt-stiffened length hung out along the stakes, and know, from a single small thread of colour worked quietly into its corner, that her own fingers had once tied every knot within it on some ordinary afternoon long since past. Martha considers the small basket of coloured thread Ruth keeps for exactly this purpose a good while before she chooses, passing over a bright, cheerful red that Agnes plainly favours, and a soft, warm yellow that Beatrice says has been Lydia's own colour since she first came to the loft as a girl of no more than 16, and settles at last upon a deep, dark blue, near the exact colour the sea itself turns in the last 4 minutes, before true dark descends each evening over the water. She works it into the corner of her own finished section, with small, careful, deliberate stitches, and sits back a long moment afterward, simply to look at it once it is properly done. It is, she understands, turning the small blue thread slowly between her fingers in the fading light, a modest enough gesture in itself, and yet it settles something in her chest that she has been carrying, unexamined, since that very first morning she woke in the room above Ruth's kitchen and found it held no earlier version of herself at all. Belonging to a family, being a wife, a mother, one voice among several gathered round a table, had never, she sees now, quite clearly, required that her own particular mark disappear from view entirely. A woman might be thoroughly, gladly woven into the whole rich fabric of a household's life, and still, in some small worked corner of it, leave behind a single thread that remained, unmistakably, recognizably, her. Ruth confirms, that same evening, packing away carefully the last of the day's finished work as the light fails at last beyond the wide door, that Elsie will take full charge of the very next order to come into the loft, a smaller net, due within the fortnight, belonging to one of the younger fishing families along the front. She herself, Ruth says, means still to come down to the loft on whichever afternoons please her, and to lend a hand wherever it is genuinely wanted. But the ordering of the work itself and the full weight of seeing it properly and honestly done will rest now with Elsie's own two capable hands. Martha, for her own part, decides that same evening, walking back slowly through the darkening lanes with the smell of tar and salt still clinging faintly to her fingers, precisely what she means to do with the small locked room waiting patiently for her at home. She will not, she resolves firmly, keep it exactly as it stands. A shrine dusted and carefully preserved against some homecoming that is neither likely nor, properly and honestly considered, even truly wanted by the daughter who has so happily gone on to build a whole new life entirely her own. It will become, instead, something new altogether, belonging from its very first hour to Martha alone. On her final full day at Greyhaven, the women of the loft gather together for a small, entirely unremarkable tea before the great mended net is carried down at last to the harbour. No speeches are made, no particular ceremony observed, only the ordinary, familiar comfort of tea and bread shared among women who have spent a whole season's worth of quiet afternoons together and see no especial reason to make more of a parting than the parting itself honestly requires. The finished net is carried down between four of them to where the waiting boat sits low at the quay, and as it is hauled carefully aboard and begins, section by section, to be paid out over the side into the grey evening water, Martha stands a moment at the harbour wall, the wind off the water lifting a strand of hair loose against her cheek, and catches sight, for one brief, passing instant among 1,000 other knots and 100 other hands' worth of patient work, of her own small stretch of deep blue thread, there and then gone beneath the darkening water's surface, carried out to do its own quiet, ordinary, entirely necessary work, exactly as every other thread in the whole great net is carried out that evening to do precisely the same. Martha leaves Greyhaven on a still, windless morning some days later, the harbour lying flat and silver beneath a sky the colour of a gull's wing, not a single ripple disturbing the water where, only the evening before, the mended net had slipped beneath the surface and out of sight. Ruth walks with her as far as the waiting trap, saying little, in her plain, unadorned way, beyond a firm, dry handshake and an invitation, offered without any great ceremony at all, to come again whenever the fancy should happen to take her. Into Martha's case, wrapped with real care in a scrap of oiled cloth, goes the small wooden netting needle Ruth had first pressed into her open palm on that second long afternoon. A gift, Ruth insists plainly, rather than any manner of loan, and one she means to hear no further argument about returning. On the train home, watching the grey coastal country give way once more, mile by slow mile, to the softer, wetter inland fields she had grown up among her whole life, Martha does not feel herself to have become, in any dramatic or sudden sense, an entirely different woman from the one who travelled down this same line a fortnight before. She has not been remade, not exactly, She understands, rather, turning the whole fortnight over, slowly in her mind, as the familiar fields slide past the streaked window, only a little more clearly than before which particular part of her own life had always, in truth, belonged to her and to no one else in the world, a part she had allowed, across the better span of 30 years, to lie fallow beneath the more pressing and far more visible work of tending a husband and raising up a family, without ever quite noticing that it had gone on existing quietly beneath all that other labor the entire while, waiting patiently only to be properly found again. The house, when she lets herself in at last with her own familiar key, stands exactly as she left it, the borrowed chairs still, she notes with a small private smile tugging at her mouth, not yet returned to the church hall after all this time, the coiled white ribbon still lying forgotten beneath the parlor table, exactly where it had fallen 3 weeks before. The quiet of the place has not changed one particle in her absence, and yet Martha finds, standing quite still in her own front hall, with her case still heavy in her hand, that the quiet itself no longer feels to her like an emptiness anxiously waiting to be filled at any cost. It feels, instead, simply like quiet, a settled, ordinary stillness, no more troubling in its own right than the stillness of the loft on a slow grey afternoon, with the sea murmuring patiently just beyond the door. She goes up that same evening to her daughter's room and turns the key she has carried the whole fortnight through in her apron pocket and steps inside at last with a clear and settled purpose now, rather than the uncertain grief she had carried in with her 3 weeks before. She folds what remains there carefully, the box of needles from the windowsill, a forgotten hair ribbon, a single stray glove, and packs them all away, gently, in a small trunk, rather than leaving them scattered where they have lain untouched. And this time, she does not leave the room exactly as it stood before, preserved and dutifully waiting. Over the days that follow, she carries in, instead, a sewing table to stand just beneath the window where the light falls best of an afternoon, and a basket of cloth and half-finished mending gathered from her own store, and before long, besides from 1 or 2 of the neighboring houses. She hangs the small wooden netting needle upon a nail driven carefully into the wall beside the window, where she might see it each time she sits down to work, and where it comes to serve, she finds much the same quiet purpose the blue thread once served in the corner of her mended net, a plain, unspoken mark of whose particular hands have made this room, at last, entirely what it now is. Before the month is properly out, she has invited 3 or 4 women from her own street to come to her on 2 fixed afternoons each week, women who wish to learn proper mending, the turning of a worn collar, the small useful repairs that might, with a little steady practice, bring each of them some modest income of her own, exactly as Martha's own steady hands had once earned her a real and settled place among Ruth's loft. She sets her limits plainly from the very first afternoon. In words she has, in truth, borrowed a good deal from Ruth herself, without any shame at all in the borrowing. This is no new duty she has taken up. The room will not stand open every single day of the week, and she means to be, within it, no more responsible for any other woman's needs than each woman chooses, freely, to be responsible for her own. When Alice comes to visit some weeks later, her new husband's arm through her own, Martha receives her as a beloved and thoroughly welcome guest in her own front parlour, and does not hurry, not even for a single moment, to clear the sewing table from her daughter's old room and restore it hastily to its former shape merely for the length of the visit. Alice, for her own part, puts her head round the door, sees the table and the basket and the small worn needle hanging upon its nail, and says only that it suits the room a good deal better than the emptiness ever had, and means it, Martha can tell at once, entirely and without the smallest trace of wistfulness in her voice at all. Down in Greyhaven, though Martha will not see it herself for some months yet to come, Ruth still comes to the loft most afternoons, and still keeps her own place in the little half-circle nearest the stove. But Elsie sits now beside her rather than behind, and sees to her own full share of the work, start to finish, without correction, and the loft goes on, exactly as it always has, only now carried forward on 4 steady hands rather than 3. The story closes upon Martha, on an ordinary afternoon, some weeks after her return, seated at her own sewing table in the room that had once been her daughter's and is now, entirely and simply, her own, the last of the daylight falling soft across her hands as she works a single line of deep, dark blue thread into the corner of the very first finished piece of cloth completed there. Beyond the window, the afternoon slows gently, unhurried, toward evening. The room remains quiet, but it is no longer empty. Thank you for listening. Rest well.